Hello, everybody.
Oh,
I'm Marilyn Bradford, and joining me is my cohort and chaos, Pam Houghteling.
I like that. Cohorts and chaos.
Yes, I think I might change my team's name to that. I like the Rascals, but cohorts and chaos is pretty good. Anyway, this is the Irreverent Therapists, and this edition is called Anger, Friend or Foe? Who's in charge? You or your anger? Anger can be a useful tool as long as you are in charge and are aware of why you're choosing it. If it owns you, it can cause a lot of damage to your relationships and your life. Join us and learn some tips about how to use your anger to your advantage and how to not let it control you.
Well, the first thing I think of as you read that is probably a lot of people are like, what do you mean about using anger to your advantage?
Yes.
And being in charge of it. Because I think so many people feel at the effect of anger. Like,
absolutely.
This is just my emotion. There's nothing I can do about it. So
they caused it. If you hadn't done that, I wouldn't have been angry.
Right. If you weren't being blah, 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 then I wouldn't have to be angry. And I mean, gosh, how much is that used to justify all kinds of mistreatment and abuse and stuff like that? So what the hell are we talking about when we say using anger to your advantage? Like Marilyn, what's your perspective on anger?
Well, when you use anger to your advantage, you're the one who chooses to do it. And it doesn't come off that often. But I was looking at several things, like if you have a toddler and they start running and you're not generally angry, and that's the thing about using anger to your advantage. It has to be something that's very rare for you with a particular person or anything. But if you have a 2 or 3 or 4-year-old running into the street, that's a good time to use anger to your advantage. Stop! You get back over here right now. Mom's good.
Well, and that makes me think of, like what is anger really? Because, for example, you could be very intense with your kid in that moment. Yes. And I think a lot of people would call that anger.
Yes.
Because we're used to, if somebody's voice is loud, if somebody's voice is intense, that means they're angry. But what if there's actually a lot more possible than that you can not have any like reactive emotion, and still deliver an intensity when it's required that's going to actually shift and change things. Get your kid to stop running in the street.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there are many situations like that. And sometimes it's with, well, and I'll go back to the intensity, Pam. I think that's really accurate. But if someone is berating you or abusing you, or stop, I did not give you permission to do that. You get out of here now.
Yeah.
There are times when anger can be used to your advantage as a kind of self-protection. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's often very useful to ask a question. I mean, it's tempting when a driver cuts you off to use road rage. I mean, to respond to that. You jerk, you blah, 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 blah. Not a good idea. I once, in Santa Fe, we have all these 3- and 4-way stops. And I once beeped at this red convertible when the car in front of them went. It was my turn, and then he went. He followed me all over town. Yeah. I just pretended. I did not go home, obviously. I pretended I was going to go way out here, and eventually he left. But I thought, you know what? I'm going to really watch honking my horn at people after that, because that's using anger at your disadvantage. Yeah. You can really get in trouble these days for that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, what all this makes me think of is, the access consciousness tools that Marilyn and I both use like every day, talks about anger as, like a few different things. One is a distractor, right? You're reacting with anger to distract you from what's actually going on. It's kind of very appropriate to have anger come up when there's a lie going on. Yes. And maybe you can tell, maybe you can't tell, but you're going into that anger, and it's because in some way you can perceive that there's a lie here. Also, sometimes anger can be like your potency as a being. Mm-hmm. And, coming out, and it seems like anger, but it's actually your potency. And I'm trying to think if that's all of it, but that's at least three different ways
Yeah, that's the
of
three.
looking at anger, right? And so to me, part of this is if you're going into, okay, I know I often talk about my mother-in-law on these shows. It's not an easy person to be related to sometimes. And my husband and I would, talk about, okay, kind of how do we handle this? Because she would get very angry very suddenly. And if I would react to that by going into my own, but let me back up. What I was going to say is I used to spend a lot of time in my head thinking about how to respond to her, how to, if only I'd said this and blah, 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 blah. But what I found was if I went into some kind of reaction and wishing she wouldn't be the way she is and how dare she say that and blah, 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 it just spiraled and kept going. Whereas if I was like, wow, it's really interesting that she's choosing that, I don't have to react to it. What is available to me now? Right. Then it was a completely different thing. And so I think whether you're the one that anger's coming up for, or somebody's directing it at you, it's like if you're coming out of reaction, if you're in reaction and you're responding from that, the whole thing's limiting and you can't use anything to your advantage. Whereas if you can, kind of internally take a step back and look at these different possibilities and like, what's actually going on here? What am I aware of? What's possible in this situation? You might use your anger or what appears like anger, as an intervention rather than a reaction.
Yes. Well, and I was looking at a couple of ways people use anger. You mentioned this earlier, they made me do it. Anger, someone getting angry can often be an excuse to not take a look at what they contributed to the particular situation. Let's suppose you have an interfering mother-in-law and there was some story on my phone where she dyed her granddaughter's hair pink or something without asking the mom. And then you're making too big of a deal out of this, that kind of thing. But anger can also be used to control others. And some people use it that way, assuming that if they get loud and angry, that they're going to get their way. And it reminds me of this, a friend of mine, the whole family, the siblings and their kids, the grandkids were going to meet at mom's house for the holidays. And they were all there and they were all chatting and having a really good time for about an hour. And then mom came out and it was like, nobody ever considers me. And she went into this tirade about how inconsiderate everybody was and nobody'd come. I mean, I think they had come and said hello, but they weren't coming and my friend got up very slowly, not slowly, but just naturally, looked at her kids and said, "We're leaving now." And did. And the mother flipped out.
Yeah.
"Please don't go. I said, "I'm sorry, Mom. We're not going to put up with this anymore. We put up with it for years.
Yeah.
You created this and we're going." And that's a great thing you can do in the face of anger. Just push your barriers down. Don't react. Just get yourself out of there.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I want to come back to this, if it owns you, it can cause you a lot of damage. And, the thing is, I think that's also about that reaction stuff, right? Like if you're in the reaction back and forth with somebody, whether they're the one being angry or you both are, you're at the effect of it and you're being controlled by their anger, your anger, everybody's reactions. And taking a moment, I mean, it can be as simple as, hey, stop. I get we need a moment. I'm going to walk out that way and take care of myself. And then I'm happy to come back and talk more when we can both talk.
It's got to be, well, let me back up. It doesn't got to be. it's helpful to know that you have control over your reactions.
Mhm.
I met with some friends in town, and we were all disappointed in the election. And there was some anger. And we said, wait a minute, what are we choosing here? And what is it going to create? And this one of the women said, when I was at my deepest, darkest, worst hour of my life, I started a gratitude journal, and I'm doing that again. And another friend said, that's a great idea. And we were talking about the power of gratitude.
Yeah.
And another woman said, what we focus on gets greater. What can we focus on now in our lives? And we got this talking about, and another woman said, my spouse does this weird thing. He starts projects and then they start another, and nothing ever gets done or finished or anything. And I used to get angry and try to control him. She finally said, finally, that didn't work. So I just said, okay, let him be who he be and do what he does. And I said, that's allowance. So we started talking. It was amazing because these are not women that are in access consciousness, but we talked about all the access.
All the access. Yes. No, you don't have to be taking access classes to, tap into the tools.
Yeah.
Well, and it makes me think about, so in my family growing up, there was no anger, Marilyn. You might not know that's possible, but there was no anger. Now, is that true? There was no outward expression.
Yes.
I would say it was a simmering hotbed.
It's very late
underneath. But it like the family I grew up in had, like, there was the judgment was being angry is not a happy family, so we're not angry. And as a family, like, nobody would deal with conflict or I had to go off to therapy for years to be someone who could deal with conflict. But it's like with anything, if you're judging it as right or wrong, then you're at the effect of it.
Yes.
Right. So that my family of origin was at the effect of each other's anger because we wouldn't let ourselves have it.
Yes.
And on the other hand, I knew a family when I was growing up on somewhere where we would vacation, all they did was yell at each other. And of course my family was like, they're yelling. But that was how they interacted. Mm-hmm. And so it's not about judging it as, well, anger's bad, anger's good, anger, if you're not judging it, then you can be aware of what's actually going on, what you have available to you in the moment, how you can handle this person, this situation, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And so to me, the real key is coming out of the judgment of you or them or the fact that there is anger or anything, and give yourself that space to then look at what's possible now. What could I say now that would create something different?
Yes. My parents sometimes they handled disagreements well. For instance, they had his and her stocks and they had his and her plants, because otherwise they would argue about it.
How do you take care of the plant? You're watering it too much.
And that seemed to work pretty well. There was a lot of gaslighting in my family, but that's a whole nother topic.
Well, we'll do that another time.
We'll do that another time. But no, we weren't supposed to be angry. And if we did, we were shut down.
Yeah. Really
shut down. So I heard stories that my dad was in World War II. And when he came home, obviously he was home for the original thing, but when he came home for good, my older sister was 2.5 years old, and he expected her to be a little adult, and apparently there was a lot of anger expressed then. I didn't get that. Mm-hmm. But we have a lot of times anger is created by our expectations of another person or a place or a situation or a thing. Well, what if you didn't have expectations?
Yeah.
If you don't have expectations, it allows you to just be present, be aware, ask questions.
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to say, if you're listening to this and you're like, okay, I hear what you guys are saying, but how do I actually get out of this and change it? I would highly recommend a book called The Gift of Allowance by Gary Lewis. It's like a handbook for using the tool interesting point of view in any situation. And you might find that super helpful.
Yeah. It's a wonderful book. Absolutely wonderful book.
Well, and Marilyn, I just want to point out Marilyn's the one who creates all our wonderful descriptions. Thank you, Marilyn.
And Pam does all the setting up. Thank you, Pam.
But where you say anger can be a useful tool. And, the thing is, if you think about a tool, whether it's a pencil or a hammer or a screwdriver or, a car can be a tool, right? Any tool, it isn't that tool is good or bad. Right. It's how you use it.
Yes.
And you can use a hammer to build a house. You can use a hammer to destroy things. And depending on what you're needing in the moment, if you need to take down a shed that's falling apart, then the hammer, using the tools to destroy something is what's needed. If you're trying to build a new shed, then you're using the hammer to create something. Yes. So in the same way, like anger just is anger. Right. And how are you using it? Are you reacting to things and spewing it all over the place and making people wrong? Or are you getting your kids' attention when they're about to do something super dangerous and they stop?
Yeah.
Same thing. Like we currently have a newish dog that needs a lot of training. And I wouldn't use anger with the dog, but there's that command that is like cutting through everything. And they hear it and they listen. Yes. And then there's the command that's like, oh, please, if you would just, and that's not very useful when you're training a dog. And so, it's like whatever it is that you're aware of, by not having judgment of it and being willing to use it as a tool and see what it can create. When you need it, if somebody's about to kidnap your kid, maybe that's the time to really let the anger out and shock them so much that they run away. So how can you use this as a tool?
Right. And always question. For instance, if your gardener's doing something really stupid, even though they're generally good, you can ask, okay, if I get angry about this, what does that create? Not a good result. If I go in and say, hey, what if we did it this way? Because right now in this potted plant, you've buried a third of the leaves, and that's not going to be very helpful for it. Or whatever the situation is. Yeah. And that, I want to bring up one other thing. We've been going on a bit because basically I have this great gardener. He just does odd things every once in a while. But we haven't spent much time talking about anger at yourself. That is never useful or productive. It's one thing to go.
So good at.
Yes, we're all so good at it, making ourselves wrong. How could I be so stupid as to do that? Well, what does that create?
Yeah.
Really, if you find yourself being angry at yourself, if you can go to question, okay, how did I create this? Where was I unwilling to be aware? What could I have done different? What will I do differently in the future if this comes up? But really, anger at yourself is never useful.
Yep. And I would say anger as a reaction with other people is never useful. It's when you're not in reaction and using it as a tool.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Cool.
Awesome.
I think that's it.
I think that is.
Let me cue the music. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.